Thanks, Emer. It's been a long time since I was at an Irish Bioenergy conference, probably 5 or 6 years ago, and I think the audience was half the size, so it's wonderful to be back and see such growth in interests and involvement with government organizations and corporates and whatnot. I did my postdoc in bioenergy research between 2007 and 2011, back when it was all the rage and there was plenty of research funding from the Department of Agriculture to do research that informed policy in this area. And while I was out there doing my fieldwork, I realized that nobody had actually taken the time to stop and ask the farmers if they were even interested in adopting bioenergy crops, or maybe what kind of crops they would consider converting to. So with no budget at all, I managed to rope 2 final year biology students into undertaking a survey of Irish farmers, and with a little bit of help from the Irish Farmers Journal and the Independent Farming Supplement, I got 172 responses from farmers all over Ireland to a 5-page questionnaire on their perceptions of the bioenergy industry in Ireland. And I had responses from all over Ireland, with every county except for Sligo. So it was a good turnout, and I got some interesting results which were actually published in Global Change Biology, Bioenergy back in 2012. And in preparing today for this conference, I thought I'd look back on my research back then, expecting that a lot of those opinions would probably have changed in the last 5 years as the sector developed. But it might not surprise you to find out that really, I think if I asked these questions today, I'd get the same responses. So this was one question that I asked farmers back in 2010 and 2011, just to identify what they felt were the obstacles in adopting bioenergy crop production in Ireland. And you probably won't be surprised to see that the greatest obstacle they felt was a lack of long-term guaranteed market, right? So that's probably still the same today. Some of the other issues that they identified were inadequate or unknown profit margins, no long-term guarantees, and the investment costs. So in 5 years, I don't think those opinions would change much, and this is just a small part of the survey. So I started looking around in preparing for this talk on what has been happening since I left the bioenergy sector back in 2011. And even last year, the Irish Times was reporting that policy changes were dramatically required in order to grow the sector. Coillte was saying there was no chance that we would meet our heat target by 2020. Teagasc was acknowledging that there had been a significant cut in bioenergy research, and that miscanthus farmers were actually plowing up their fields and going back to their old farming methods, or they were supplying Northern Ireland digesters, which is a lost opportunity for Ireland in terms of meeting our own renewable energy targets. So I think the last few years have been in some ways dark days for the bioenergy sector, particularly with respect to farmers. But I see the Paris Agreement, and particularly our own Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act, as new opportunities for the sector. So we finally have a legal obligation in Ireland to significantly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and quite rapidly. I mean, we have to do it essentially by 2050 and become a fossil-free society. And so that means that bioenergy will have to play a role in that. And hopefully that's going to give some new incentives for policy support in this sector. So assuming that we'll be cautiously optimistic that these incentives will come into place, I wanted to bring my perspective as an environmental scientist and also involved in the NGO sector on some of the issues around sustainability of the sector. And I was thinking particularly about the wind sector and how we have this wonderful resource in the form of wind that could really help us in committing to climate action and reducing our emissions. But as some people have already acknowledged, we didn't really handle it appropriately, and we lost a lot of public support in how wind was rolled out in this country. Bioenergy is now in a stage in its growth where maybe we could address these issues early on so that we don't have the same hassles and costs later on when we're trying to address this kind of citizen buy-in or sustainability issues. So the NGOs have actually created, just to show you, some of you have probably already seen where we are in terms of our distance to target. I know this slide came up on a previous talk, and also this is where the EPA has projected our emissions will go. So the black line at the top is the targets we need to meet, and the EPA projections up until 2035 show that our plans so far essentially mean we'll be increasing emissions. So we don't have any strong plans to address greenhouse gas emissions yet. That's where we are to date. But let's assume that things will change now in the coming years, now that we've signed the Paris Agreement and have the Low Carbon Development Act. The NGOs have created a great report to inform policy at the European level on bioenergy sustainability. And some of the issues they've raised are things like, we can't afford to have bioenergy solving the problem on greenhouse gas reductions, but then causing other problems. And like any sector, there are going to be environmental and socioeconomic impacts that we need to think about now so that they don't cause trouble later on. Things like issues around water quality and air quality. David Dodd raised the air quality issue. There are scientists in Ireland that are concerned now that if we burn wood biomass in significant quantities, that will have implications to particulate matter, and even with respect to chemicals like benzpyrene, which is a known carcinogen. So these are issues we need to address, and we need to work with EPA now to make sure they don't cause problems later on. Any kind of unsustainable agriculture can have environmental impacts, particularly around biodiversity. So monoculture biomass farming can negatively impact biodiversity, and we have an obligation under the Convention for Biodiversity not to let that happen, and to continue to protect our natural capital even as this sector grows. It's important to remember that bioenergy is part of a global solution to climate change, and that means that it can't also cause global problems. So I'm speaking specifically about importing biomass. We already import, I think it's cocoa husks from Malaysia and palm kernels from Nigeria to co-fire our peat-burning power plants. And this has implications with respect to transport emissions and climate change. And also certain types of biomass that we import could have negative impacts in those countries with respect to land grabbing or competition with food resources and impacts on the cost of food in those developing countries. So just because those kind of environmental and social problems are happening far away doesn't make them any less real, and it's something we need to consider now. We also need to remember that bioenergy is not carbon neutral. There's been an assumption to date that bioenergy is carbon neutral, but in reality, I just want to show you a study. This is a study by Professor Timothy Searchington in Princeton, and it was used in a recent report by the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds in the UK, where he took the emissions data from the UK energy sector and found that if you use conifer biomass that's only 20 years old, you can actually create emissions that are even worse than coal. So it's really important to remember that burning biomass also releases carbon, and how we manage those trees depends or will impact what kind of emissions we'll get out of it. I think Board BIA has always been acknowledged as being quite good on carbon calculations for the agricultural sector. Now there's debate on whether or not they use that data effectively, but I think the bioenergy sector too needs to become leaders in carbon calculations for the bioenergy sector, and I think we need to acknowledge that it is not a carbon neutral industry. Bioenergy will probably always compete with food production in terms of available land area, and certainly as the sector grows, that will become more of a problem, and we need to be mindful of that, particularly because we have a growing global population that we need to feed, and we simply can't afford to lose land area from food production. I know that the EU is looking more and more at using waste for bioenergy rather than using original sources. And so our designs need to factor in that whole cascading design system where products are first used, or biomass is first used as a product, and then the energy is harvested afterward. And finally, one of the things when I'm talking to farmers that I always mention is, and I think the floods last month were indicative of this problem, that our changing climate is going to make it more and more difficult to do beef and dairy farming, certainly in places like the Midlands that are continually prone to flooding. One of the recommendations I always say is when you're facing any risk, one of the strategies to deal with that is to diversify. And I think farmers really do need to diversify into other income sources. That could present an opportunity for the bioenergy sector in encouraging farmers to diversify into biomass production. But it also means that monoculture farming in general is a risky business for farmers. And so we need to think about they're protecting themselves from climate risks, by looking at diverse sources of income. So that could be bioenergy, but they might also need to look at other sources of income too to protect themselves from inclement weather. So where are we going? Well, nationally, I think that we can expect a greater emphasis on policy coherence. And your next speaker, Professor Alan Matthews, co-authored this fantastic 217-page report to Irish Aid. I don't know how long ago that was. Was it a few years ago? Yeah, recommending that we really need to look at our national policies and see how they match up with our international objectives. So that's something that we need to start doing now, and any national policies that might negatively impact the developing world will have to be altered. That's particularly an issue for the bioenergy sector if you're talking about importing biomass. At the EU level, the EU has acknowledged that it needs a bioenergy sustainability policy, and it expects that to come on stream between now and 2017. So there's a lot of lobbying going on right now on where that policy should focus, but the EU is already talking about putting caps on biofuel production, specifically because of issues of land use change and the issues that I've raised previously. So we may be facing a cap in terms of the bioenergy sector too as part of this policy. We might also see more of a focus on decentralized local energy systems because the EU considers them to be more efficient than bigger biomass production. And of course, they have community benefits which are more beneficial too. So there might be a shift away from the bigger energy systems. And my hope is, though, that while this sector is developing, you'll take into account all of those sustainability issues that I've mentioned now so that later on down the line we have greater citizen buy-in and we don't have the kind of extra hassle of trying to address these issues when the sector has become much larger. Thank you.